Could you have imagined a year ago, when in the run-up to the general election, when Jeremy Corbyn was still leader of the Labour Party, could you have imagined, certainly the leader would never have come, and could you have imagined any front benchers coming to address a one-day conference of the Jewish Labour movement? So I thought this was a very, very important change. It did fill me with hope, and it reflected really the strong attitude and policies and actions that Keir Starmer has taken since he became leader of the Labour Party in April. It's very warming, just at a very simple level, that his first telephone calls on becoming leader were to members of the Jewish community. And I was fortunate enough to get such a call. I didn't actually support him for leader. I supported Lisa Nandy. I particularly wanted a woman, and I thought she was more empathetic to my views. But I have been really heartened by Keir's performance, not just on anti-Semitism, but on a whole range of issues since he became leader. I'm totally behind him, and I want to help and support him as he roots out anti-Semitism from the centre of the Labour Party, part of the legacy that Jeremy Corbyn left him.
Well, I don't think there's anyone better, frankly, to ask this to, but how do you, I don't mean to sound like I'm trivialising this, I think this is a perfectly serious point. How do you rate him so far in terms of his ability to tackle anti-Semitism?
I think he is doing a very good job. You know, he's made it his first and most important objective to root out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He is having now regular conversations with representatives of all the Jewish communities, all the Jewish communal organizations. He took the EHRC report, I think, very, very seriously and gave a totally appropriate response. I have to say to you that I was also rather taken aback by the directness and the strength of the recommendations in the EHRC. I hadn't anticipated it. I thought we would get quite a bureaucratic report talking about things like the Labour Party's record keeping, but actually we got a pretty straight, critical report and very hard-hitting. I think he's taken that on the chin. And I think also his response to the fact that Jeremy was put before a tribunal and readmitted into the party, I think was an unfortunate sort of pushed us back. You know, he was tried by a broken system and it came up with a broken conclusion, a false conclusion. And I think, again, from that, he's responded strongly and well, and, you know, by lifting from him the whip so that Jeremy Corbyn today is not a Labour Member of Parliament. And the other thing, just very generally about Keir, he's been immensely effective in the House of Commons. He really does take on Boris Johnson, particularly over the coronavirus issue. And there have been a lot of, whilst this is a national crisis and we ought to be working together, the mishandling of so many issues has been exposed, I think, brilliantly by Keir in the House of Commons. And the other thing, which we saw at the Jewish Labour Movement conference on Sunday, he's got a whole host of really talented faces and people who you haven't seen before because they refused to serve under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, who are now holding front bench positions and who did come and join with us on Sunday. Can I just say one final thing about Sunday, which was so great? There were actually more than 700 people who listened to Keir. When I looked down, it was sort of something like getting on for 750. But there were over 1,000 people in that room talking about the future for the Labour Party, not just focusing on the past and the anti-Semitism, but looking to the future. And I felt very energised and lifted by the fact that so many people chose to spend a Sunday with us. And that there were also so many young people there, enthusiastic, full of bright ideas, and committed to those Labour values that got me to join the party over 50 years ago, and which we sadly damaged through the anti-Semitism that took place under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership.
There was a report that suggested that when Jeremy Corbyn was suspended and then was, within a matter of what felt like days, probably it was a couple of weeks, was readmitted into the party, Sir Keir did not reinstate the whip. So as you rightly identified, Jeremy Corbyn may be a member of the Labour Party, but he is not a Labour MP. It was reported that you had said to Sir Keir that if he would reinstate the whip, that you would quit. Was there any truth in that?
I found myself in a really difficult position. I hated having to talk about Jeremy after the EHRC report was published. We should have been focusing on the findings of the report, and we should have been focusing on the pain of those who'd been the victims of anti-Semitism, and we should have been focusing on the way forward. And Jeremy, by his ridiculous intervention, made himself the centre of the story again. And his total refusal to accept the extent of anti-Semitism as documented in a report put forward by a statutory body, and his complete insistence that those of us like me who were calling out the anti-Semitism over the last 4 or 5 years were motivated by partisan politics rather than motivated by fighting anti-Jewish hate. His failure to accept that both those things were wrong. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at the heart of the party, and Corbyn himself and his team did politically interfere in the complaints process and therefore in driving out. His failure to accept that, I think, was intolerable. I think when he went up against a group, none of us were told that that was going to happen. The first I saw was an hour before that. I can hardly call it a panel of worth, because it was a panel convened under the old National Executive Committee. So it reflected the whole culture and way of working and the people who had been running the party under Jeremy Corbyn. And that was what the EHRC had criticised. So the very mechanism that the EHRC had criticised was used to reinstate Corbyn. I saw his statement. In his statement, there were two things I find deeply offensive. One, all he's got to say is sorry. He's got to say, I accept responsibility and I am deeply sorry. He can't. All he does is he always puts in a conditional apology. So I'm sorry if I offended you. And the other thing is he didn't accept the EHRC report. What he actually said in his statement was that he supported Keir Starmer, who accepted the EHRC report. And on the basis of that statement, I thought it was wrong to readmit him to a party when one was committed to rooting out anti-Semitism. The two just don't hang together. And I couldn't see what else to do. And I think Keir, when he said that he was going to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn was not a Labour member of Parliament until he had addressed these issues, that don't worry me, and don't just worry the Jewish community. The concern about this goes much, much wider than the Jewish community. But until those two issues were addressed, he could not have the privilege of calling himself a Labour member of Parliament.
Now, there is actually more that I wanted to talk about with you, but I'm very aware that you have to go now. But if I may ask for just a yes or a no on this question, and then I promise I shall leave you in peace. If the whip was reinstated, would you leave Labour?
If Jeremy Corbyn accepts responsibility for what happened on his watch, accepts the EHRC report in its entirety, and proffers an apology, an absolutely complete apology, I think in those circumstances, I think it would be wrong not to let him back in. But he has to be willing to do that. And just let me say, my experience of him is that he's incredibly obstinate. He's pretty vain. He is less than, I think, sensitive and cognizant of the issues that he's raised, and he just doesn't like Jews.
Dame Margaret Hodge, thank you so much for speaking to us on the Jewish News Podcast. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.